Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our June meeting. And our topic is biodiversity conservation. Why does it matter? And our guest speaker is Ann Dale, and I'm going to tell you more about her in a few minutes. I'm Joanne Hunter. So welcome, everybody, and please feel free to participate. I'd like to just start with our recognition of the land. So Toronto is the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So we'll get on with our program for today. How many of you knew that today was World Environment Day? It's really apropos because our topic today is biodiversity conservation. And the theme for this year's World Environment Day is land restoration, desertification, and drought resistance. So I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. Ann Dale is a professor emerita in the School of Environment and Sustainability at Royal Roads University. She's a leader in the country on virtual real-time e-dialogues. So that's very cool. We'll be able to experience her online e-dialogue here today. She held her university's first Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Community Development, is a Trudeau alumna, and Fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science. She's won many awards, which I'm not going to go all into, but one of them was the Canada Council for the Arts. Her book, At the Edge, Sustainable Development in the 21st Century, received the 2001 Policy Research Initiative Award for Outstanding Research Contribution to Public Policy. Her most recent book, entitled Edging Forward, Achieving Sustainable Community Development, was released in February 2018. She has published 5 other edited books on achieving sustainable development, social capital, communities, sustainable development, industrial ecology, and community vitality. Dr. Dale has led a major climate change adaptation and mitigation research project in British Columbia and is a co-investor on 4 other SSHRC-funded grants. Her newest research is exploring governance for a carbon-neutral society. Thank you, Anne, so much for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you for the invitation and for the marvelous team from Climate Action for Lifelong Learners. So we're here today to discuss biodiversity and what we can do, So biodiversity is the library of life. Essentially, it's the living archive of natural life on Earth as it now exists. So from bears, salmon, and worms to trees, soil, and fungi, it is the diversity of species living in an area and the relationships we have with one another. Biodiversity, if you want it to be utilitarian and not just go on how beautiful and wonderful it is to live with a biodiverse universe, it's also critical to human health. It provides many of our medical drugs. For example, the Madagascar rosy periwinkle is a plant from which we derive vincristine, one of the key cancer-fighting drugs in use today. 20 to 25% of drugs used in modern medicine are derived from plant chemicals, and over 12,000 active compounds from medicinal plants are known to science. Our biodiverse forests, soils, wetlands, and prairies clean our air and water, sequester carbon, provide habitat for pollinators, and keeps pests and disease in check, to name only a few. However, sadly and tragically, biodiversity is disappearing in front of our very eyes. We think we can have our cake and eat it too, but we also have to leave space for biodiversity. How much biodiversity has been lost? 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and many are disappearing 1,000 to 10,000 times their natural extinction rate. Since 1970, we have lost 60% of mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles, and 2/3 of invertebrate like butterflies and bees. We have now entered, sadly and tragically, the 6th mass extinction of biodiversity. So what is causing biodiversity decline? Habitat loss is the biggest driver for biodiversity loss. The more habitat we occupy, the less space there is for other creatures. And we have to start asking ourselves questions as Canadians is, what is Canada without the polar bear? What is Canada without the loon, the call of the loon, when we go, those of us privileged to have cottages? Invasive species also affect the space for biodiversity. Pollution, overexploitation of natural resources, and the most latest research is showing that climate change has even more of an impact on biodiversity loss than originally thought. So there's a lot of drivers for that loss, but hopefully we're going to talk about what we can do. So the next slide. So the Biodiversity Conservation Action Agenda, a call to action for Canadian decision makers, was developed by a group of 20 members from Women for Nature. We collectively identified and discussed strategies to help inform decision makers and the Canadian publics. And we also identified 3 critical drivers for biodiversity loss. And one of them I think is really interesting, our disconnected relationship to the land, which has a connection then to reconciliation and Indigenous communities who value their relationship to the land over many other issues. Overconsumption is another major one, and habitat loss, as mentioned before. The federal government has now committed to conserving and protecting 30% of Canada's lands by 2030. We argue we need to conserve 50% by 2030. However, it is within provincial authority the establishment of protected areas. So we bump up against federal-provincial relationships or the lack thereof in the establishment of these protected areas. I'd like to reference you to a colleague of mine's movement called Nature Needs Half. I like that metaphor because it shows that we can't have our cake and eat it too. We have to leave space, and we have to leave undisturbed habitat for biodiversity if we're serious about conservation. The key themes that emerged from our expert panel, done through a virtual dialogue on the Biodiversity Action Agenda, was the first, reconciliation, connection, and collaboration, reclaiming our relationship with the land, reframing biodiversity, redesign of how we build and where we build, integration of decisions and strategic partnerships, and cross-sectoral implementation. We came up with 24 recommendations, and we have quite an extensive curated biodiversity library, which has a lot of resources. But I have more hope for establishing perhaps 50% through the Indigenous Protected Areas program. May save us because they can transcend federal-provincial conflict over protection of areas. It's a win-win, as it also provides economic opportunities for Indigenous communities in more isolated areas. Another critical step is nature-based solutions, which my colleagues reference. There are methods like protection, restoration, or I prefer regeneration, and improved land practices that will help to mitigate floods, heat waves, and we're sitting with a heat dome warning here in Ottawa this afternoon, air pollution, fires, and storms. For example, green roofs can help cool the air, absorb excess water, and reduce energy use while supporting biodiversity and making cities more livable. If any of you have other things to add or you've got questions, don't hesitate to jump in, please. Oyster reefs buffer coasts from waves and filter surrounding waters. Green infrastructure practices that use soil and plants as a treatment system can help remove contaminants from storm water infiltration. These infiltration sites can double as amenities for parks to provide recreational benefits. I didn't know this, but when I was thinking about, what I wanted to discuss with you today, 1 in 5 people who live in Canada face some level of flood risk, and 1.8 million households are at very high risk. So we've got to change how much more space we're going to pave over, and are there different ways to pave? So I'd like to now talk about, so we've got to move from, bricks and mortar and impermeable pavement structures to what some of us are now referring to natural infrastructure or green infrastructure. I prefer natural infrastructure. It's essentially just working with nature rather than against nature. So seeing yourselves as a part of nature rather than apart from nature. So it'd be a simple thing like asking your political decision makers or your civil servants to add natural asset management to traditional capital assets. So what can you do? In our backyards? And I just started to think about this, and when we started our biodiversity campaign about 5 years ago, where did the need to have tidy gardens come from, rather than more wild or more space? So this year, I don't know about you guys, I for the first time didn't rake leaves off anything, and all the plants came through the leaves, and the leaves also enrich the soil. So it's a win-win because it also reduces my workload. So, I think that's an important question. Why do we need to have tidy landscapes rather than more natural landscapes? I also suggest that everybody reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a heat pump. And again, to reiterate, the latest research shows that climate change will have even more major impacts on biodiversity. Join a BioBlitz, as mentioned earlier. And there's 2 software programs that you may be aware of, and forgive me if I'm being boring. They're iNaturalist and Merlin. So iNaturalist is where you can upload to the biggest data software things you observe in nature in your own particular, in your neighborhood, in your region, in your communities, pictures, and they will give you information on it. Merlin is about birds. Municipal governments play one of the most major roles in the quality of our day-to-day lives. And I don't understand the low voter turnouts that we have. So use your organizations, use your networks to urge your neighbors and friends to vote. Grow native plants, wildflowers, trees, or shrubs on road verges. That's a really, really simple one to encourage your municipal decision makers to do. Has more of an upfront cost, but then it lowers the downside cost because you don't have to, it's self-sustaining. So other than planting in the beginning, that's your cost. We need to urgently map and protect remaining wetlands. They are the lungs of the earth, and we're actually destroying too many wetlands in development. Here's another thing that, have you ever wondered why developers are allowed to build on floodplains? Ask your officials to integrate biodiversity conservation into official community plans. Establish natural and semi-natural wildlife corridors and linkages. Create bylaws to require new developments and redevelopments to develop green paved areas that have permeable paving and elements like rain gardens, infiltration trenches, along with native trees, plants, flowers, and shrubs. Update codes and bylaws prohibiting features of natural garden. And many, many of these steps will reintroduce beauty and wildlife back into urban areas. And then I'm just going to close with a few for the federal government, because I want to hear from you. You've probably got far better ideas than what I've just presented, but urge your elected officials federally to implement the Biodiversity Action Plan. Send it around, slap it on people's desks. Take a newspaper editor out to lunch and discuss biodiversity and its intersectionality with climate change. So we're supposed to have sustainable forestry in Canada, and some of you may find this offensive, but there is so little old growth forest left that urge the federal government and provincial governments to end all old growth forest cutting. And why this is even more important, I just learned the other day, is that these relatively intact ecosystems serve as an archive for what we want to regenerate in other areas. So that it's even more critical as they're disappearing to sustain them. And then lastly, map Canada's critical habitats for endangered species. A friend of mine is a federal court judge, and a couple of years ago, he had a rule on an endangered bird out west. And essentially, he said in his ruling that it's schizophrenic to have an Endangered Species Act when we haven't mapped where their critical habitats are. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we can do it.
And the federal government promised this 30 by 30 preservation of land and water. How are we doing in
I
terms
think, yeah, thanks for that. I think we're at about 17%. But as I said, it's really about, getting the provincial governments on board. And, I'm going to get a little political here. Like if you recall the Prime Minister's announcement on accessible housing, and essentially he's, going to lead if the provinces don't come on board. And immediately 4 provinces said that they wouldn't join the program. And yet we're supposed to have a crisis in housing. So it's about time that we had greater collaboration. But as I mentioned, I think the Indigenous Protected Areas Act and their movement towards establishing these protected areas are going to save us, because neither government wants to take on the Indigenous communities. And now most of the areas that they are targeting happen to be in rural isolated areas, but so be it. We still need to conserve those intact, relatively intact ecosystems. Does anybody else have some recommendations or suggestions for how we can move this file forward and get it more politically active? I was very disturbed at the last federal election agenda, and maybe here's something. Biodiversity wasn't mentioned at all. But mind you, there was very little policy discussion whatsoever, other than personality jabs back and forth.
And you have it's Karen speaking, and you have a new book on governance and biodiversity. I wonder if you could speak a bit to what's in that and one of the important roles that governance plays.
I have, yeah, it's my edging forward, the latest one, I think, from 2018. Essentially what I talked about today, but it talks about governance, and I talked about the title of that. Each chapter has a fairy tale heading, and the fairy tale heading for that particular chapter is Knights of the Round Table. Well, implicit in that is that the Knights of the Round Table were all male. So I also talk about the lack of diversity in private sector boards, the lack of diversity in universities. If I remember correctly, there's only one university board of governors that approaches 40% gender diversity. I think it's the University of Manitoba. So the first thing is to start valuing diversity even in our own organizations, and how important that is for new perspectives. And the research shows that boards that are more diverse actually are attached to businesses that are more successful. So I wrote a journal article on diversity all things counter, spare, and strange, why human beings are so bad at diversity. So that's some of the things, and we definitely need greater diversity in at our political level. I mean, that's very sure. Elizabeth May talks about the reason she ran for politics is that she wanted to build more collaboration into the system. And that she recommends we vote only for those politicians, regardless of parties, who are collaborative. And I have now finished interviews across the country for my governance research, 40 people. It's a privilege to have been able to talk to them. And one of the surprising things for me, and perhaps not for all of you, is that in spite of the evidence that a program is successful and it's working, the incoming regime, regardless of the evidence, in the majority of cases ends that program. And why do they end that program? Because they want to brand their own information. So I also learned, for example, 1974, the incoming regime ended the Social Housing Policy Act. So we did have an act that said government had a role to play in social housing policy, and it was ended. Well, why did we ever think that the private sector was going to look after social housing? Interesting, eh? Anyway.
And I just wanted to share something that I've been doing. It's not enough, but every year Nature Canada, the nature-based solutions group here has been participated in Nature on the Hill. And that's where we all get together on one day, either in Ottawa or online, to talk to politicians about our pressing need to create more green space and more green infrastructure. So that's one thing that I've been doing. I'm not sure that it's enough, but it's a step.
I think every small step is worth it, because how do you get major change? Through many, many small steps leading to the bigger steps. And I think COVID-19 showed us how critical green spaces were to people's well-being. And especially, can you imagine being stuck into in a two-bedroom apartment with 4 children if you're a single mother and you don't have access to green space? And we can green everywhere besides greening verges, community gardens, green the little patch in front of your condo or your house or your apartment building that nobody looks at, cares for. Everything counts. I won't talk about lawns. I don't want to offend people, but think about lawns and what do they contribute to the environment? Very little.
Aaron, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I'm calling from the West, and I apologize for not starting my video. It's before my rise and shine time. But
Yeah.
I would very much like to know what, when you talk about natural infrastructure in the public sense, what does that mean, other than you referred to lawns? But it sounded to me that you're talking about things like roads. Have I got that right?
Yes, partially. I mean, there's places in Europe that have a solar grid built into their bikeways, for example, so that they give energy back. There's all sorts of wonderful things that you can do, such as that. But when I talk about natural infrastructure, maybe this is a good example, is the erosion of shoreline in front of houses that have been built too close to the shoreline. Well, what you try to do is regenerate that shoreline to what it was like prior to the building of the house. Bulrushes are very, very effective at stopping erosion of the shoreline and stopping flooding. And then there's some areas in my neighborhood of lakes where I live where there's so many speedboats going by, it's eroding the shorelines even more. So bulrushes, restoring wetlands, that kind of thing, but using the natural assets from nature. So for example, green roofs. You can have green roofs in one of two ways. You can have vegetation there. A lot of restaurants now are starting to grow herbs on the top of roofs and using the herbs for their food. But there's also another way, especially in Ontario, I can speak about. It's energy co-ops. You can rent your roof, if it's a flat roof, as a solar rooftop, and give that energy back to the grid. And some of the energy also goes into the building. So that it's simply just thinking, it's valuing nature for the benefits it provides and learning about how it can teach us to live more sustainably. Hopefully I've answered your question.
Yes, you have. Thank you very much. And it is a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's only because of you guys being here and your interest. I noticed in the chat that Jane has mentioned a relevant diversity event from Imagine Canada, June 26th. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Jane?
It's a free webinar, probably aimed at leadership in the charity sector throughout Canada. Haven't been on it yet, but I've signed up for it. They do a lot of work to promote diversity at the leadership level throughout Canada.
Okay, thank you
So
for that.
Imagine Canada is the voice of Canadian charities. It's an Ottawa-based umbrella group for
Right.
for
Yeah.
advocacy for things like better recognition of charity donations, for example, to the government, but also educating the sector on, especially put a lot of effort into human resources work in
Right.
the last while, and they've just added a whole new section on compensation and benefits for nonprofit staff
Oh, thank you.
as part of their HR intervals site. All this stuff's free.
Jane, would you like to go ahead and ask Anne the question? You had your hand raised, and then afterwards we could have Peggy, who also had her hand raised.
I have a two-part one. First, please talk about lawns. I'm having so much trouble despite having a showcase front yard for food and native plants. I've still got lawns on both sides of me and haven't even convinced my own neighbors.
Oh, I know. Is it ever hard, eh?
I don't realize if you don't have kids and dogs, there's not much point having a lawn. And if you do have kids and dogs, you don't want to put pesticides on your lawn and chemical fertilizers.
Well, I'm going to be more provocative then, and I don't mean to offend anybody because we all have the things we can do within our own environment. Lawns are dead space. I call lawns dead space. They contribute absolutely nothing to the environment. They take pesticides, they take too much water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as you're not being told by your municipality to get rid of your lawn, I just had something come through in Toronto. A close friend of mine, Nina Marie Lister, is being, and luckily she has a lot of money, so she can fight the municipality, is being sued for her lawn.
Yes.
And so it gets to that thing about why do we have to have tidy landscapes? What is it that we consider beautiful? Why isn't a wildlife garden more beautiful than a lawn? So
you talk my language.
Yeah, maybe we should start asking those questions. Maybe this group here can have a dialogue or a workshop on that topic, because
I love that because people ask me, well, should I go to permeable pavement instead?
oh my God, no. Oh,
well, it's better for the driveway, but it's not better for a lawn replacement.
that's right. And it's not better for flooding either. If you want to guarantee that you may have some issues down the road. I hadn't thought of that before. And thank you so much for this, because maybe we should have on a website pictures of beautiful gardens in cities, in urban areas, to show people what exactly they can do. And the other thing is, it's an attractor for pollinators. It's an attractor for wildlife. Do you value that? Do you want that in your cities? Does that make a city more human and your well-being?
And I've even had people tell me that they've changed their jogging or cycling routes to go past my front lawn because it's so much better than all these grass boring lawns. It gives them joy. I had a second question. I'm glad you related some of the biodiversity issues to health, because that's one way to reach people who don't seem to care about nature. Do you have some wording as well for helping them understand the relationship to food security? 'Cause it's
Yeah,
another
we
issue I
do.
get into, and then
Yeah.
I'll put my video and let somebody else.
Yeah, I do. We did a video, and I'll give it to the organizers, linking to the Irish potato famine in the 1800s, right? So that is a perfect example of an ecosystem crashing and food security. So I've got tons of stuff, and I'll forward it on the relationship between biodiversity and food security. A friend of mine has a Canada Research Chair, one of my most brilliant postdocs I ever had the privilege of working with. His chair is in biodiversity, human health, and sustainability. So I'll provide that link as well. What myself and another person are working on, you may think it's a bit hokey, but I don't think it is. One of the things that I tried to get to later in my research is, how do I communicate my love and my passion for a wildlife lawn rather than a wildlife front yard rather than a lawn? So it's trying to use beauty. Someone referenced my slides. So I have more slides that are extensive on biodiversity, and I'll share some of those too with the organizers. I don't want to overwhelm them, but try to bring the beauty of nature. Have you ever seen, what got me started on this was I saw an ad for a SUV, and the backdrop was nature. And I thought, my God, they're using the very thing they're destroying to sell. It's the beauty of nature. So we're trying to work on an article called "Can Beauty Save Us?" And it's getting to some of these ideas, and the idea of bringing back aesthetics and beauty into urban areas. So I've given a podcast link, a link to my podcasts, and in one of them I'm having a podcast with Nina Marie Lister from Toronto, who started the Wild Urban Gardens movement there. And it's really good on urban habitats and biodiversity conservation. So that's in the links too as well.
Thank you, Anne. It's been a very, very interesting presentation so far. So I have a comment and then a question. So one of the things I just want to mention is, we've had a cottage in Haliburton, which is
Nice.
north of, Haliburton, for like over 50 years. And I have to tell you that, many, many positive things are happening in terms of nature and the land and biodiversity. When we first, we were one of the very first cottagers in our area, and people at that point were completely clear cutting their lots. They were building right by the shoreline. And over the last 50 years, there are a multitude of regulations that have to do with protection of shoreline, connected to water pollution, connected to septic systems. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Like many, many positive things are happening. So I just want to kind of, just sort of give a good news story that I think that the whole environment that I see in cottages, at least in our area, in our municipality, has really changed. So that's positive thing. One of the questions I have is, I'd like your opinion that I've heard on the news recently that for fire prevention and control, that they're cutting massive amounts of forest, to create barriers out west. So how does that, is that a good thing, not a good thing? What is it? How does it affect biodiversity? So I thought maybe you could comment on that.
Well, it does affect biodiversity, and that's all of our solutions aren't win-win. They have to create those break systems. unfortunately, and they have to, Peggy, they have to. I'd like to have some more proactive regulations in place that we map where the most vulnerable fire areas are, and we no longer let people build immediately up to them, right? There's the problem. So people are building their, we're encroaching more and more and more on wild. I mean, I hate to say this, but there's just too many of us. And so we've got to, but there's solutions for everything. We have enough science, we have enough information. We have to densify our cities. We have to provide more infill. We have to have more diversity of housing stock. But for those people who choose to live in rural, more wild areas, those buffer zones are going to be important. And actually, what they're beginning to rely on now is Indigenous knowledge about fighting fires, which is really interesting. So there are some lose-lose situations. Animals are more adaptive than we think we are, but then we have to ask the question, what are we making them adapt to? Have any of you seen, I think it's in Toronto, and it's about how, it's a video, and I'm not going to remember it or the link, of how coyotes have adapted to living in the city of Toronto. And it films them at night, at night, and it's absolutely amazing. So, do we want to be like Australians that, and unfortunately have so many introduced species, that we see wildlife as pests, or we see ourselves as having a responsibility to live in our areas with wildlife? Yeah, Caroline's just mentioned that she saw a fox cross her neighbor's lawn. Yeah. So it's about leaving space. Here's a little anecdote that I find really interesting. So I don't know if you guys know about wildlife crossings. Again, Nina Marie Lister is heavily involved in those, where they build these, and they have competitions in the States where they build these crossings over major highways, and they're beautifully designed so that the animals don't get hit. And there's an economic cost to cars being damaged and people being damaged, so the wildlife going over. So what if we design, that's about redesign. So if you know where your biodiversity hotspots are, if you know where your vulnerable species are, then you don't build your roads right through it. You build your roads, you move it. So in Iceland, you're going to laugh at this. They actually build their roads around where they believe fairies are. Seriously.
Wow.
There are ferry crossings in Iceland, and they divert the roads around them.
You're not talking about Ferry, you're talking about Fairies.
That's right. Yeah.
And I just wanted to mention about the tiny forest, that movement that originated in Japan, and how people are taking very small places, but they're building sort of small forested areas with a diversity of plants, and they're attracting birds and other species to those areas. And that's a really good thing to get involved in too. So you don't need a big space to.
No, not at all.
And the other thing, I have a couple of other things. I started to learn about invasive plants, and I walk up and down my street and I see all kinds of invasive plants, like strangling dog vine. And I just like, do you say anything to your neighbors? Like, what do you do? Because sometimes they actually plant them because they think that they're pretty.
Yeah, that's I'll share an anecdote with you, and then you have to make your own decision about how you approach it. So my colleagues tease me as the queen of dialogue in Canada. And but on my lake, I've now sort of mitigated it a bit, as the crabby environmentalist. So I actually cut off dialogue because of some of my interventions. So you have to be careful, Joanne, what you may consider invasive. If they've planted it, they consider it attractive. And it's only by having neighborhood conversations. You know, CBC radio used to have agricultural conversations in the 1950s. I've got a paper on this and what we wanted in agriculture. And those they were ended. We don't have enough community conversations. So you could approach it by saying, have you ever thought of this plant and why this plant? Because it attracts biodiversity. So we know there are certain plants that attract bees. And then there's the other issue, which and I've just learned some of this myself the last 5 years. You don't rake up your leaves at least until the end of May. If you're going to have to rake up your leaves, which I'm never going to do again, because I prefer to sit in my garden and have a glass of wine. Native bees overwinter in the leaves, and they don't leave till the end of May. Salamanders are in those leaves. That's where their home is. So you could introduce it that way, like if you plant this, then you'll get this. But then, you know, so here's a conundrum. So I read the other day that dandelions are very, very good, and goldenrod is very good actually for certain insects. But dandelions are so friggin' invasive. So I'm still pulling them. I made a decision. I don't think anybody can be 100% sustainable. So we all have decisions to make. I try to minimize my interventions in my environment, not maximize them. And it's tough sometimes.
And I have one more thing. We need a paradigm shift. How can we start to understand we are part of the web of life and not separate from it?
Well, I think it's about emphasizing the benefits of relationships, human relationships to one another, but also our relationships to other species. And then trying to get people to connect to the land. We want people outdoors. We want children outdoors. The more they know, if you don't know something, you won't love it and you won't save it. So what you guys are after, lifelong learning and those connections. And I think it's through showing the beauty of what those connections give us. And you do it through art. Like if you go to my websites, you'll see a lot of art. Now, here's another one. I'll have to send it. We've developed a land trust. The other thing is Nature Conservancy of Canada is doing phenomenal work in conserving land. And you can create land trusts. You can will your development rights to the Nature Conservancy of Canada. That's a tough one, Joanne. I mean, I'm trying to do it through dialogue, leading conversations, connecting academics with, and we talked earlier, right, about the Third Act and all the organization you guys are involved in, and it's connecting the dots. But I'm now thinking the biggest thing we can do is just talk to everybody we know about. The next election is X. Go to some of the meetings that they're going to hold, ask the questions, like hold up the biodiversity action agenda and say, I'd like each of you to talk to this. And then if they all have to sit there like zombies and say, we don't know anything about it. We've distributed that, by the way, to every single federal MP in English and French about 5 years ago.
That's a really good suggestion. And there are questions and comments in the chat. A lot of really interesting ones, like, whoops. And sorry, turned on my. Carolyn actually says, in the UK, the advertising standards don't allow oil companies to show greenery or nature within their TV ads, which is a really interesting solution. And Louise Montague says, is there a good source to find a list of natural assets that we can encourage municipalities to adapt for natural infrastructure?
You know what? There isn't. That's one of the things I checked before this discussion with you. Email Paul Gregory and ask him that question and ask him to give you some answers at Nature Canada. That's his job. I'll also share with you, I have a list of the key natural based assets and examples and websites that you can draw from. So I'll send that document forward, and that can be shared with whoever would like it.
And I just wanted to interject, you are such a resource of knowledge, and we will come back to you with everything that you've listed in order to, with you, pull the links together and then distribute that.
Thank you. All you're referencing is I have a terrible memory now. Thank you, which I do.
Well, the YouTube helps because there's lots of YouTube videos on coyotes. I just checked to see if I could find one on adapting in the city, but because I live in the beach and there are all kinds of coyotes around at night that we see, that we're very careful not to have our dogs too near.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of fear, right? I read articles about how coyotes are going to snatch children and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So part of that paradigm shift is if we consider ourselves to be in relationship with other animals and insects and not the big ones. Worms are critical for biodiversity conservation, by the way. And, people just, so it's a paradigm shift where if you see a worm on the sidewalk after a rainstorm, you stop and move it over to the grass or whatever, right? Rather than step on it. It's little things like that that make the biggest difference, I think, over time. Plus, it makes me feel good.
You've got lots of interesting feedback in the chat, and all kinds of things. Well, one question that we haven't asked yet is disinformation is regarded as one of the key risks, global risks for 2024. With respect to biodiversity, what are the leading sort of sources of mis and disinformation that are not necessary sources, the actual specifics of the things that you hear that are disinformation?
Well, I think it's the message that, so you can look at the environment, it's how the messaging is. So you can look at the environment as a benign, safe place in which to live. And there's a paper on this, or you can look at it as it's a very dangerous place, and you have to look after yourself, and you have to be aware of biodiversity. And those messages come through subliminally quite a lot. And the other biggest one is you can have your cake and eat it too. That we can continue to develop, we can continue to exploit the way we are doing, and have loons and have polar bears. That's just not true. It's the same as right now, one of the messages the oil and gas companies are giving us is we can still have oil and gas. And actually it's the framing of it's the words. I read a critique of the word natural gas. It's not natural gas. It's not natural. It should be called fossil fuel gas. Somebody was suggesting that we can have that and reduce greenhouse gas emissions considerably. It's just not true. And also that the other thing that I think the disinformation that comes is these are not urgent issues. They're incredibly urgent. And I'd say biodiversity conservation is the most urgent issue, which my climate colleagues don't like me saying, because there's no second chance from extinction. There isn't. I think we still have 10 to 12 years to get our greenhouse gas emissions down. And I think we're hitting critical tipping points. I think things are starting to move thanks to some of the wonderful young people. Greta Thunberg's efforts are just phenomenal. I participated in a climate march here in Ottawa about 3 years ago. I'm smiling because I asked my family to go for my birthday. And my husband is very conservative. He said, do I have to go? They'll arrest me. And I said, come, you can join. So, but they're all becoming voting age. And I think we're getting more sophisticated in what it is we're doing. And there's some other things too. There's, I think in 2026, there's going to be a fund that is a tax on IT companies that will bring millions of dollars into governments worldwide. There's also, for the first time, the global fund for small island states and for developing countries, mitigation and adaptation, the amount has been met for the first time. So it's slow, but it's moving. But I believe in the universe, and I believe in the power of the universe to save us from ourselves, ultimately. So I just feel I'm more confident now than I've been. I lost some confidence for about 5 years, but I'm more confident now that things are going to move rapidly. For the first time, and I think we should have strategically thought of this, energy, natural resources has exceeded 30% globally. And that, the impact of that, so solar and wind are picking up tremendous, exceeding far more than the expectation. 30% worldwide is now on renewables. And what that means then is the demand for oil and gas for the first time is decreasing. And if I was starting over again in climate change, I would emphasize that action, like rapidly adopting those alternatives and providing incentives to accelerate the take-up, because then the demand for oil and gas goes down dramatically. And so are heat pumps, by the way. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the take-up of heat pumps in Europe.
Oh, Brian, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I will. The climate activist group does not have its act together. It's fractured. I think the biodiversity world does not get enough attention, and I don't really see it as having an activist collective, i.e., a lot of people who are spending their time focusing on biodiversity. And I wonder why that is, since biodiversity is as important as climate change. I'm wondering if you have any comment about that.
That's a great question. I've spent a lot of my time, particularly when I was a federal government executive and had a lot more money, trying to build capacity in the environmental movement. What makes a good environmentalist, activist, is a lone wolf warrior. I can do this, I'm going to do this. There's not a lot of collaboration. So it's starting, but it's slow. So the environmental groups involved in biodiversity are starting to work together. So you've got Nature Canada, you've got Nature Conservancy of Canada, and the funding pool for all NGOs has gone down tremendously. So that's also increased the competition. We need some leading spokespeople who will concentrate on biodiversity and start leading the charge across the country. So, but I think it's up to us. I think we should go out to political meetings and ask, you know, what are your opinions on conserving biodiversity, and what policies do you think should be in place to conserve biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. So that, and you know, join organizations and encourage them to collaborate with others. But it's I think, thanks to the question about one of the barriers, it's this belief that we can have our cake and eat it too. And it's just recently that the science community, they were focusing, is it species, is it genome, et cetera, et cetera. They've just come to consensus on the fact that the major driver for biodiversity loss is habitat loss. Yeah. So once we can start connecting the dots between all those people and groups working, but it's the same as, you know, David Suzuki is a colleague of mine, and I once tried to convince him that the David Suzuki Foundation had an imperative to provide leadership in the environmental movement and work with other groups and collaborate with other groups when you have a successful project and you get the funding for it. Well, they concentrate on BC. They're very, very centered in BC, but You can't conserve biodiversity in one province only. Animals don't respect provincial territories, and they don't
Yeah.
need.
And one of the things that's happening is a Seniors for Climate movement across the country. And Brian and people here on call have been very active, and maybe others on the online. And we had a first organizing meeting with 500 participants signing up from across the country, and commitment to do different kinds of activities on October the 1st. And you've certainly encouraged me to think about what we can do on biodiversity.
Well,
On
I don't use climate change. I always talk about climate change and biodiversity. So I would urge you and humbly suggest you to say Seniors Day of Climate Actions and Biodiversity Conservation.
yes, thank you. Good.
I will do that starting
Thank
today.
you.
Yes,
And
Thank you very, very much.
I also like the term climate remediation rather than climate change for
Can
what
I agree, but can I argue for climate regeneration? So,
yes.
yeah, regeneration means that there's net positive benefits. I think we in the environmental movement concentrated too much on the losses and on the problems, especially in the 80s, right? We didn't concentrate on the solutions. There is so much happening across the country, like with you guys and all the groups you're associated with. So think about strategically how to connect the dots. But I just think it's so easy through collaboration. It takes time to collaborate, but that's how we learn, actually. We learn what others are doing, and how can we connect then? And how can we collaborate with other groups on projects, just like we came to. So regeneration, if you think, I've been long in the tooth about sustainable development and sustainable community development, and look how long it took us to achieve even basic agreement on what sustainability was. So a lot of us have now moved to regenerative sustainability. So the emphasis is on net positive benefits, that there are the possibility of identifying, as long as you're aware of identifying net positive benefits and communicating those to people. If you do X, you get Y. And that's what we have to do with biodiversity more. I can't believe that I never listened to not cleaning up. My background is British, so you have to have tidy English gardens, right? That it took me I'm going to be 76 in September, and the first time in my life I never raked my leaves up. Anyway, small story, but
Yeah.
so if you can, yeah, I've got one of the best papers on regeneration and why it's important. This is a bit pointy headed. You can never restore an ecosystem. Even stepping into that ecosystem as a researcher, you're impacting the species that are in that ecosystem, and you change the dynamics. So that's why we don't talk about restoration as much anymore. We talk about regeneration. And I like regeneration because I'm going to try and write a book on reconciliation, reconnection, and regeneration, and how if doing one will lead to the other two. Because I don't know about you guys, I'm getting tired. Everybody talks about reconciliation. What the hell is it, and how do you do it? You know, there are glimmers coming out of people that are working on it, particularly the young people, about what it means. Anyway, boy, we've got a really, really dynamic chat. I hope we can save that.
we will, for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I have another suggestion to make. I was horrified when I learned that the boreal forest up north, which is just as important as the Amazon, is being cut down for toilet paper and Kleenex and paper towels, that kind of thing. Procter and Gamble is the main company. So I like to encourage everybody to consider using non-tree type of paper products. So bamboo, for example, and I buy bamboo toilet paper and paper towels and that kind of thing. And that's one of the suggestions that I have.
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, we have to, and it takes time, right? I gave a guest lecture when I was out at Royal Roads last, and a comment from one of the younger people was, Anne, you talk so positively about what we can do, but we don't have time. So then I shot back at him and I said, how much time are you spending on social media? So Joanne, you're very right. But it does take time. But time is also related to reconnection, right? Taking the time just to be and to reconnect with what's important in your life. Here's a little anecdote that's interesting. Did you know the recycling program was created in Toronto in 1967, I believe? I'm not going to remember the two names of colleagues. It was never created to create a recycling industry. This is why you have to be careful of the benefits or co-benefits or unintended consequences. It was created to make people aware of how much they were consuming. So look at, I talk about the commodification of life, the commodification of education. It's all about bums on seats and, the whole debate now about international students. So that's interesting to me. So we have to be careful about what it is that we're aiming for. That, it's the same as computers. When they brought in computers, it was going to save paper. Well, it didn't, because people just printed more. So we're very, very good at inventing tools and less good about examining what the social benefits or disbenefits are of what we're doing. And so that's lifelong learning. Like, I want you guys to show me what lifelong learning is and its connections and how we can get this stuff out without spending more time in front of a computer. How's that for a challenge? So this is just, this is your action component to your meetings, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've sort of touched on all of these. Reduce your plastic use from a health and a biodiversity perspective is critical. So if you can think of ways not to purchase plastic in the first place, it's the first R of the 4 R's, reduce. That'd be really big.
Those are all really good.
But that's simple, right? And it's not simple in some ways. The question I get asked, I'll just end with this. I get asked a lot, is it better to buy organic than non-organic? And I said, okay, my hierarchy of purchasing food, my first choice is local organic. My second choice is I always try to buy seasonal, although my husband is totally the opposite. The third thing is I will buy local, non-organic before I would buy organic from other countries.
And that's an interesting and well thought out hierarchy. What are your reasons behind that?
My reasons behind it are, first of all, I want to support local community resilience by growing as much of your own food. It's related to food security, right? So you want to grow as much of your own food. You want to encourage your farmers. But there's also another aspect to farmers markets. It's the social capital that is generated when you're talking directly to the producers. And one producer, and I think this is true, says that when food is shipped a long way, when your vegetables are shipped a long way, there is embedded energy in each vegetable that is lost through the shipping. So you've got also the connection to sustainable transportation. So local organic, but then I will buy local over international organic for the same reason. What does your community need? Your community needs sustainable economic livelihoods. And then seasonal, of course, touches all those transportation issues, the waste, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And I want to take this time to really thank you for being with us here today. You've really helped us to understand that protecting biological diversity is central to solving climate change, but also is central to our survival on this earth. And we have a responsibility in taking action and protecting our vital ecosystems by supporting conservation efforts, reducing pollution and habitat destruction, as well as implementing sustainable land use practices and through our individual choices. So thank you so much for enlightening us on this topic.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the audience participation and interest in your comments.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne and Joanne.